So this is my favorite part of Reconstruction because it's just kind of crazy. This whole thing just becomes a mess. So before I kind of start with it, I need to kind of refer you back to your vast civics knowledge for just a second. Anytime a bill is proposed, how a bill becomes a law, maybe you're having some flashbacks to Schoolhouse Rocks. But when Congress passes a bill, it doesn't actually become a law unless, of course, the president signs it. If the president doesn't like a law, he can veto the law, which means it doesn't become a law unless it goes back to Congress and can get a 2/3 majority in both houses. It only needed a majority the first time around, but if the president vetoes it, then Congress can vote on it again, and if it gets 2/3 this time, then it can override the president's veto and become a law anyway. So I bring that up because it's going to be pretty relevant for this. So in the last video, I told you about the difference between radical Republicans and the president's plan for Reconstruction. Radical Republicans wanted to punish the South. They also wanted to help African Americans, particularly the former slaves. So this first bill that's being introduced here is the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau was a program that would provide schools. I really should have put schools in here, and I'm sorry, I forgot that. But provide schools as well as handouts of food and clothing and other basic needs to the former slaves. And it was also available for poor white people as well, but it was done predominantly for the freed slaves. So this was an organization to help them. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was a law that was proposed in order to get rid of the black codes, which hopefully you remember from the last video. Black codes were the day-to-day restrictions on the lives of former slaves. So the Civil Rights Act would get rid of the black codes, say they were illegal, and it also proposed the idea of citizenship, which would lead to the 14th Amendment. Well, those bills passed Congress, but Andrew Johnson, the president, keeping in mind that he is a Southerner himself and a former Democrat, he didn't really like these bills, so he vetoed them. However, after the midterm elections in 1866, the radical Republicans got so many more people in Congress that they had enough to actually override his veto. So those two things became law. All right. Now, the next thing they proposed was a new amendment to the Constitution. Again, civics flashback. An amendment is proposed by Congress, and it takes 2/3 of both houses to propose it. And then in order for it to be ratified, it has to be ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. The president doesn't actually have anything to do officially with an amendment, but hold that thought. The 14th Amendment proposed by Congress would grant citizenship and equal protection of the law for all people who were born or naturalized in the United States. This introduced the idea of birthright citizenship, which is something that is still debated by some people today. But it basically means if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. And it was proposed during this time in order to specifically refer to African Americans and former slaves as citizens because they were born in the United States. Now, Johnson doesn't get to veto an amendment, but what he did was he used his power and his influence as president to convince state legislatures not to ratify the amendment. Now, it eventually got passed. It just took longer. So Johnson is once again trying to at least slow down the process, if not attempting to get rid of it altogether. The next law that was proposed, this is 1867 now, is another thing that radical Republicans wanted to do was to punish the South. And one way to punish the South would be to implement martial law. So the Reconstruction Act of 1867 put martial law in the South. What this means is that the South would be divided into military districts and that troops would occupy the South and would kind of keep order and all that in the South. This is a very harsh form of rule. It is never viewed as a good thing to have. But so this is putting a very strict rule on the South. Of course, you might predict what Andrew Johnson would do with this. He has to sign it for it to become law, but he does not. He vetoes it. But there's enough radical Republicans, again, that they override his veto. So they're still getting what they want, but Johnson's kind of becoming a pain in their butt because he's trying to, stop all of these laws that they're trying to pass. And kind of forcing them to take this extra step of overriding him all the time. By the way, Andrew Johnson holds the record still to this day as the president with the most veto overrides. And he was only a one-term president, not even technically fully one term, but he has more overrode vetoes than any other president. Here's the military districts in the South. So radical Republicans are not happy with Andrew Johnson at all. But they can't really do anything about it. Andrew Johnson is going to be the first president to be impeached, but hopefully you remember what impeachment means. Impeachment means bringing charges against a president for wrongdoing or abuse of power or breaking laws. It does not mean actually kicking out. We'll get to that in a second. The problem is Andrew Johnson hasn't done anything that he's not technically allowed to do. He's been vetoing their every bill, but he's allowed to do that. So they can't really impeach him if he doesn't do anything that's impeachable. So here's where this whole story gets really crazy. They basically set him up to get impeached by passing a law called the Tenure of Office Act. So Andrew Johnson inherited the cabinet from Abraham Lincoln. He didn't get to choose his own cabinet. He got the cabinet that Lincoln had had. Well, one of the members of his cabinet, Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, Andrew Johnson didn't really like him and was planning to fire him. Well, guess what law the radical Republicans decided to pass? They passed a law that said the president cannot fire a cabinet member without their approval. Well, they knew that he was going to do it anyway, so they made a law saying it's illegal for him to do it. Well, he vetoed it, of course, but they overrode it. And then Johnson fired Edwin Stanton. So this means that he has now broken a law. Now, he's not stupid. He knew he was breaking the law when he did it, but he kind of predicted that this was a dumb law, that he would not actually be found guilty, in any kind of impeachment or whatever. But so he fired Edwin Stanton, and now there is an opening for the radicals in Congress in the House, to impeach Andrew Johnson. So they do. But of course, to impeach does not mean to actually get removed. As we all know, because we've experienced this more recently, the House votes to impeach a president, but then he gets a trial in the Senate, and the Senate acts as a jury. And it takes 3/5 of Senate votes. Now that's a vote of 60. I don't remember exactly how many Senate votes there were back in 1868, but he ended up getting he was one vote shy of being found guilty, convicted, and removed from office, but he was saved by one vote. So Andrew Johnson did become the first president to be impeached, but he was not removed from office. He was saved by one vote. But the lasting kind of legacy, he is the first president to be impeached. It's not looking good on him. He's not really going to have any aspiration of running for re-election by this point because his reputation is pretty tarnished by this whole debacle. Here is a visual depiction of the Senate trial of Andrew Johnson. So in the election of 1868, Andrew Johnson does not run for re-election. The Republican who is going to run instead is former General Ulysses Simpson Grant. And he's going to run against Democratic challenger Horatio Seymour. This is a pretty strange election. And you can see the electoral map there. Some of the southern states still had not been readmitted to the Union yet. Those are the ones that are in green, so they didn't actually have any electoral votes in this election. Grant does end up winning the electoral vote, and so he will become the next president. But he's not an experienced politician, and that's going to hurt him as president. He's not the most effective president. He's a general. He's fine at that. Not a great president. Some of the radical Republicans even liked having him as president because they wanted to kind of use him as kind of a puppet, because they figure he wouldn't try to thwart them at every step like Andrew Johnson had, and he doesn't have the political experience and acumen to be able to do that. So anyway, Ulysses Grant becomes the next president. The 15th Amendment was the third of the Reconstruction Amendments. following the 13th, which abolished slavery, 14th, which granted citizenship and equal protection to all people born in the U.S. Now, the 15th Amendment says that the right to vote cannot be restricted based on race or previous condition of servitude. So it says that you cannot be denied the right to vote because of your race or because you used to be a slave. Keep in mind that it still could be denied the right to vote because of your gender. Women still cannot vote. The intent of this amendment is to basically give all men the right to vote. But please note how this is worded, because it's really important how this is worded. The 15th Amendment does not say all men can vote. It says the right to vote cannot be denied because of race. So there's going to be some loopholes in this, and we'll talk about this later on. But Southern states are going to figure out ways to keep Black men from voting, but say it's for a different reason. Not because they are Black, but because, they can't read, so therefore they can't vote, or they can't pay a poll tax, or, various other ways to try to restrict voting. But it wasn't because of race, they'll say. So we'll talk about that more later. The Enforcement Act was also passed along with this amendment to basically make sure that the government can enforce suffrage, to make sure that people are granted that right to vote. So that is it for this first half of Reconstruction. So we've now covered presidential Reconstruction, which was the original plans to be lenient on the South, then the radical Republicans taking over and basically running Reconstruction by passing lots of laws that Andrew Johnson kept vetoing until they managed to get him back by impeaching him, but not removing him from office, and now Grant is president. So we will pick up with the decline of Reconstruction in the next ones.